when we put the curriculum together in October, and then refined it after the election, we added another session. It's usually 4 Fridays in February. We added another session on anti-Semitism that we discussed a couple weeks ago. And it was also supposed to include protecting Jewish institutions in the diaspora. We didn't really get to that, but if people want to ask questions afterwards, I can address it. But I was very bothered last year by certain things that were taking place regarding Israel-Diaspora relations, especially all the controversy around the passing of the nation-state law and the controversy around the Kotel. And I thought that it would be a good thing to examine what that relationship looks like. And then obviously we knew that there was going to be an election in 2019 in Israel. We didn't know when. It could have been as late as October, November of this year. At some point it looked like it might take place as early as February or March. Now we know that it's slated to take place on April 9th. And obviously the indictments that were announced yesterday were looming for a lot longer, but I don't think that anybody could have anticipated that there would have been this firestorm surrounding the involvement of the American Jewish community, and particularly a couple of American Jewish institutions, in the Israeli election. And I'm assuming a certain baseline of knowledge, but I'll just remind people who've been hibernating for a little bit that there is an election taking place in Israel on April 9th. Prime Minister Netanyahu is running for re-election as head of the Likud party, and next week we're going to talk a lot more, diving into the weeds as you may, or wallowing in the quagmire of the Israeli electoral process, who the major parties are, what their background is, how they came into being, what outcomes, I don't want to say I'm going to predict, but are feasible or more likely than not following the election in what will be a month from next Friday. But this week we're going to talk about the controversy surrounding certain things that took place pretty much immediately after last week's class. So over the weekend, again, we can talk about this more next week, but we already discussed the electoral threshold. What that means is that unlike the historical Knesset, where it was direct representation, and if you got 1.2% of the vote, you earned your seat in the Knesset, and you could have one person, and there often was one person from one party who held one seat. Probably one of the more famous ministers of the members of the Knesset was Meir Kahane, who served one term from 1984 to 1988, and then he was barred from the Knesset thereafter. The successor, or the ideological successor of the Kahanist movement, which is called Kach, and that was the name of his party, is a party called Otzma Yehudi, which you could translate into Jewish strength or Jewish power. And it's like how people were arguing about ISIS or ISIL and whether or not that had any political connotations depending on which acronym you chose. Jewish strength sounds good. Jewish power sounds good too, but it's very reminiscent of white power and other racist, clannish organizations that have used comparable terminology to promote what most people would consider to be fairly nefarious agendas. So this group would have no way, no hope whatsoever of participating in the Knesset, since now the threshold has been raised to 3.25%. In other words, a party cannot have any representation in the Israeli parliament unless it has at least 4 seats. If you got enough votes for 3.5 seats, you're excluded. And all of the votes that your party received are distributed pro rata among all the other parties that are eligible to sit in the Knesset. So if any other party got 3.25%, it could also be that you got 3.15%, but a smattering of parties got 2% or 2.5%, and therefore you would get, in other words, if in the first round of balloting you're not quite at 3.25%, but you got just enough to go from 3 to 3.25%, you could sit in the Knesset. It actually happened 2 elections ago. But by and large, Otzma Yehudit, Jewish power, Jewish strength, would not be in the Knesset. And this wouldn't have even become a debate unless the Jewish Home Party, Abayit Yehudi, which was run by Naftali Bennett, didn't break up. Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, the two most prominent members of the Jewish Home Party. He's a very telegenic, bicultural, bilingual businessman serving the elite army unit, and he did not enjoy the sort of religious Zionist label. He wanted to be a much more political and much less of a religious party. Ayelet Shaked, who's his right-hand person, Minister of Justice, she's completely secular. So they decided they're going to form a new party called the New Right, which left the Jewish Home sort of wallowing on the brink of maybe getting in, maybe not. And the New Right is, polled to get somewhere between 6 to 8 seats. The Jewish Home would have gotten 4, maybe 5 seats. And Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, basically cajoled those two parties. He has no influence over Bennett and Shaked. Bennett wants to take the Prime Minister's job at some point. There's no such threat from the Jewish Home and Otzma Yehudit. So he midwifed a political accommodation. It actually took place the morning of, well, I found out about it. It took place on Thursday, but I read about it on the morning, and I got some questions that I want to reserve for this class about that act. He was lambasted quickly by a lot of people in Israel. The Supreme Court famously upheld the right of a party to be excluded from the Israeli parliament because of its views. Its ideology is deemed inimical to the values of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Kahane was deemed to be a racist. He believed in expelling all the Palestinians. He had proposals for laws that smacked of the Nuremberg laws, disqualifying Arabs from certain positions. And the Knesset overwhelmingly voted to prevent that party from running for re-elections. In 1988, he was not allowed to run for re-election. Kach was never a political party that tried to return to the Knesset, and he himself was assassinated by an Egyptian in Midtown Manhattan in 1990. So the perception that Bibi Netanyahu is so politically desperate that he's going to resuscitate such an odious party that was blocked from the front door and try to pull them in through the window or through the back door in order to try to get 1 or 2 more seats in the next Knesset was fodder for his political opponents in Israel, and even some people who share his more right-wing Israeli ideology, to say, this is just beyond the pale. You've crossed the line. It's okay to agitate for political mergers, but this was just too much. You can't do that. And his defense was, well, people do it all the time. It was Avigdor Lieberman from Israel Beitenu who proposed years ago that the electoral threshold be raised because he wanted to make it more difficult for these fringe Arab parties. They had like half a dozen Arab parties in the Knesset with 1 or 2 or 3 seats each, and he knew that they would never, ever, ever combine into a joint list, so that way their political representation would be diluted even more. Their political representation is diluted naturally because they tend to vote in lower percentages than the general population, but this compounded that dilution, and it worked for a couple of elections. In the last election, in 2015, they did the obvious thing. They combined, 4 parties got together, 4 parties that don't naturally disagree with each other. From the outside, we may think that all Arabs are homogenous and their political inclinations are identical to one another, and nothing could be further from the truth, but they created a political convenience, and they got 13 seats. And that also was eroded a little bit when they finally, when they got the final tally, but now they've split up, and they split up and then reconfigured, so there was going to be 1 and 3, and now it's 2 and 2, and they're each polling to get about 6, maybe one will get 7 seats, Balad Ta'al will get 7 seats, and so they'll have 12 or 13 seats in the next Knesset, which is approximately what they have today. But the force with which the prime minister exerted his will and the gamesmanship that he appeared to play in order to cajole, really push these parties into an 11th hour, 90th minute, if you prefer a regular clock or a soccer clock, agreement was just a gift to his opponents, to his political opponents. And that's okay. I think it's fair game to, and I don't think anybody would disagree, if you're running against Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you're a Benny Gantz, if you're a Yair Lapid, if you're an Avi Gabay, this is an invitation to come and say, well, look, people, look, voters, do we want to elect somebody who's very comfortable getting into bed and almost certainly having a member of the next Knesset, ideally from the Prime Minister's perspective, within his own coalition, who is a racist, who believes that Arabs and Jews should not be allowed to marry each other, that Arabs should not be allowed to own property, and that all Palestinians should be, exiled from the state of Israel. If I were running against Benjamin Netanyahu, I would make those comments. However, some of those comments came from outside of Israel, which is fine. If Eli Lake writes in Bloomberg that this is reprehensible, and Bret Stephens, who, and both of these are, I would say, center right, and Yossi Klein Halevi, who's American but has been living in Israel for the past 40 years, calls this a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. As individuals, I believe that they're fundamentally entitled to express their points of view. The AJC, the American Jewish Committee, came out as an organization and called this a reprehensible act by getting into bed, or by certifying, legitimizing a racist party. And AIPAC retweeted that, and they reused the word reprehensible. Not David Harris, who's the executive director of the AJC, or Howard Kaur, who's the head of AIPAC, but these were organizational, institutional comments about an act by an Israeli prime minister, which I think, we can trace the history, and we will trace a little bit of the history of U.S.-Israel relations since before the creation of the modern state of Israel. But this was a very signal event where organizations that are clearly pro-Zionist, there's no other label you can attach to AIPAC. The Republican Jewish Coalition attacks AIPAC from the right, J Street and others attack AIPAC from the left. But I think that AIPAC's pro-Israel credentials are secure. AJC has gone through a more variable history, and I will share with you what I believe is an unbelievable historical irony in a minute. I'm on the local board of the AJC. I've been an active member of AIPAC and had a co-chair of a political action committee here that works closely with candidates in the House and the Senate. I was surprised. I was surprised that as an institution they decided to comment, even though I may personally agree with the comment. I thought that as an institution it was an unusual thing for them to say. Why? If you trace back the history of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, and there's an alphabet soup of Jewish organizations that has existed not just in this country, but especially in this country, for well over 100 years. The AJC was founded in 1906 by German Jews who were a mixture of anti-Zionists and non-Zionists. So now I'll give you the history and come fast forward to the irony. So the AJC was a very powerful organization, had a lot of very wealthy members. They were mostly of German descent, and they were quite successful relative to what was going on at the time. Remember, the Jewish community in the earlier part of the 20th century was nothing like the Jewish community today, but they wanted to also demonstrate that they were not like these greenhorns of the Eastern Europeans. As we talked about in previous classes, this was a period punctuated by massive immigration, over 2 million Jews from the Pale of Settlement and other parts of Eastern Europe coming to the United States during the course of about 40 years, from 1882 to 1923, when the quotas were imposed. That's a staggering number if you think about it. And the legacy Jews, the German Jews who derived They were the second wave. They'd arrived at sort of the earlier part of the 19th century, early mid-19th century. They were, that was the big wave that made the Northeast the sort of center of Jewish life in the United States. Before that, you had mostly Dutch Jews who came from Amsterdam to South America, and then from South America to New Amsterdam to Charleston to settled a little bit in Boston, New York, Rhode Island, but mostly in the South. Up until 1832, Charleston, South Carolina was the largest Jewish city in the United States. But these German Jews wanted their institutions, and the American Jewish Committee was a big one, and they were fervently anti-Zionist. Some of the people tempered their positions with, let's say, non-Zionists, but they weren't a very Zionistic organization. And the reason for that wasn't because they didn't believe necessarily that Jews should have a homeland, but they didn't think it would be good for the Jews to agitate for one, because it would foster all these accusations of Jewish loyalty, dual loyalty, and who are you loyal to? And the Zionist effort in the United States was very weak for, I would say, from the inception of modern Zionism, late 19th century, obviously Herzl's coming of age in 1897 and the first Zionist Congress had very little American participation. But because so many Eastern European Jews were coming into the United States, they brought their Zionism with them. They were always outsiders. They were never part of the moneyed class from where they came. They came from shtetls, and they left poor and they arrived poor. Some of the other Jews who were here were quite successful. And it wasn't until Louis Brandeis in 1915 embraced Zionism that, and Brandeis was not an Eastern European Jew. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky, went to Harvard Law School. He had a very successful practice in Boston. A year later, he was actually appointed by President Wilson to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So Louis Brandeis was a big deal. And he became the head of the Zionist party in America. And he sort of made it somewhat kosher for those Jews to be Zionists. But the AJC in 1950 was headed by a man named Jacob Blaustein. I don't know if anybody ever heard of Jacob Blaustein. And that means that we're all pretty young in the room, because Jacob Blaustein was iconic. He was extremely wealthy. He built a very impressive empire in oil. He was friendly with 5 successive presidents, starting with Franklin Roosevelt. He was appointed as part of the American delegation to start the United Nations, having nothing to do with the Palestine question, the Jewish question. He happened to be Jewish, but he had that kind of clout. And he was essentially a non-Zionist who was head of the AJC, and in 1950 he made a very important agreement with Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. They agreed at a dinner attended by a lot of other people that there would be a policy of non-interference, that Ben-Gurion would not agitate. We're going to talk about something called Shlilat HaGalut, if anybody knows what Shlilat HaGalut is, the negation of the diaspora. Part of Israel's DNA when it was founded was, you got to live in Israel. And I think we're all old enough to remember being guilted of not being in Israel and sending money to Israel, because these are our poor brothers and sisters, and you're living a less than fulfilled life if you're not living in the Holy Land. And this was a big, there's these famous jokes about Ben-Gurion running into some Jew in Zurich who tries to brag to him and says, "Mr. Prime Minister, I visited Israel 3 times," and he responds, "That's twice too many," right? So that was the mindset of the period, and the American Jewish community was offended by this, and I think legitimately. I mean, you don't want to be told that you're not a complete Jew just because you happen to live in Baltimore, which is where Jacob Blaustein was. And if you think about it, when did the diaspora community start in the United States? 1948. Right? There was no diaspora. There wasn't a sovereign Israel against which you could say you're living in the diaspora. I mean, all Jews lived in the diaspora. There were Jews living in Israel. But as far as national sovereignty, in 1948, that choice then became a real choice. You can live in the sovereign state of Israel, or you can live in some other place on the planet, but you can't argue that you don't have a national homeland, because you do, and people fought for it, and it was, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So there was a lot of opportunity for the Ben-Gurions of the world to guilt the Jewish population into not doing more for Israel, not moving to Israel. And Blaustein and Ben-Gurion came to a very amazing accommodation that has really withstood the test of time. I mean, if you think about it, there's been very little interference by the American Jewish community in the Israeli political world, which was not inevitable, because I talked about the anti-Zionists and the non-Zionists. Of course, there were very many pro-Zionists. There were many Zionists in the Jewish community. Over time, leading up to, certainly during and after the Holocaust, and the Zionists, there were very few anti-Zionists left. There were the non-Zionists and you had the pro-Zionists, but the pro-Zionists weren't necessarily people that Ben-Gurion was comfortable with. Pro-Zionists were luminaries like Emanuel Newman and Abba Hillel Silver. I assume some of these names are familiar to you. They were leaders of the Jewish community in the United States in the 40s and 50s, and they wanted a voice in the Israeli political system. They fought very, very hard to generate American support for Israel at the outset, and they thought that as a consequence, they ought to have a say, maybe even have a party in the Israeli Knesset that would represent the views of American Jews, because this was a very powerful community that had a lot of sway and a lot at stake in what happens in Israel. So Ben-Gurion found the perfect prototype. He found an extremely wealthy, credentialed person with access to the resources that heretofore did not exist. And there's some fascinating anecdotes, I'll share one with you in a second, about Einstein, of fundraising attempts that failed, certainly with that German, Jewish, non-Zionist element. And they made a deal. And that deal was, we're not going to be overly aggressive in pointing our fingers at American Jews because they're not moving to Israel, and you're gonna lay off our political processes. And so the irony is that 71 years later, 69 years later, there was in 1950, but the AJC as an institution, you don't see Jasek Isaacson, David Harris, or other names who are involved with the AJC. Nobody's name is associated with it. The AJC is an organization castigates, chastises the Prime Minister for his reprehensible agreement. So I think if Jacob Blaustein, who died in 1970, was exhumed and resuscitated and asked to pronounce on that, he'd admit that, maybe he'd agree with the comment, but it would be a violation of the agreement that he reached with then Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. And it was, I think, one of the more successful chapters in this relationship, because ask yourself, if you saw somebody doing something that you didn't like, would you speak up? And the answer is probably not. There's a famous story of, Moses seeing somebody, kill another person, and he killed that person, but that's homicide, and that's Moses. But for the most part, we tend not to speak up. If it's somebody we care about, we'll probably be a little bit more inclined. If it's a family member, I don't want to sort of put anybody on the spot, but a lot of people in the room are parents. So as parents, we feel we have a responsibility to raise our kids. Now, for those of you in the room who are grandparents, to what extent do you feel that it's appropriate to tell your children how to raise their kids? They're your grandchildren, you care about them a great deal, but it's probably not a good idea. First and foremost, it probably won't work. And second of all, it probably doesn't, it probably won't help. And if you take it one step further, if you're great-grandparents, and there's some great-grandparents in the room, then that's a lower percentage strategy, even more. So the impetus for us to go and tell Israel or tell the Prime Minister what we think is real, and it's fine. But now we have this uniquely sensitive period of elections. And elections, unfortunately, or fortunately, are flashpoints for our most visceral inclinations. We see this here in the United States. We're likely to see it in Canada. We were talking earlier about what's going on, and the current Prime Minister has his scandal that he's dealing with. But if you look at, I don't think that Canada has developed the politics of personality. I know that Canada has not developed the politics of personality that we're seeing here in the United States, and that, and this we will talk about more next class, Israel is turning into that. I read some correspondence among people who are worried that Israel is becoming more and more incendiary, more and more vitriolic. It's starting to resemble the US. To me, that's amazing, because I always thought that the United States was relatively sedentary and tranquil in comparison to what's going on in Israel. And the United States has become worse, and now Israel's trying to catch up. And including accusations of exposure 40 plus years ago at a scouting school, between Benny Gantz and a woman, an accuser living in New York. And I think there's going to be more and more of that. That's just the political realities of the world in which we live in. But coming back to this relationship, I think that this family analogy works. And you think of it as, I don't know, we're the grandparents, but I think that if the Israeli Prime Minister, and David, the AJC is not the Prime Minister, AIPAC's not the Prime Minister, but I think that if the Israelis tried to tell American Jews how to vote in an election, let's say in 2020, the Israeli government said, listen, you may not like paying off women hush money so they don't say anything. You may not like having, half your cabinet plead guilty to lying to Congress. You may not like, and I can go on and on and on forever. I mean, the last thing that the president did that I found, unpalatable was saying that the leader of North Korea had nothing to do with the murder of Adelan, one leader. Yeah. But the list goes on. I mean, it would take up 5 more of these classes. Yes.
Where do you put Bibi speaking to Congress right before our elections?
That's a great point. It's a great point. I'll address that in a second. So I think most of the Jewish community reacted badly to that. So Steve, I think you've helped me make my point. I think we would find it totally inappropriate for an Israeli prime minister or an Israeli institution to tell us how we should vote in an election because something may be better for better for Israel or not as good for Israel, and it would also be very damaging for the community here. The joke I told in the first class about the bull doesn't always lose. I mean, you have no idea who's going to be the next president of the United States, and there's no reason to alienate approximately 50% of the country. I think, and I've said this probably a couple of years ago when it was more topical, I think that could have been a lot better orchestrated, and I think we're still paying a price for the Democratic Party. To your point, you had Elizabeth Warren come out and say Senator Warren is one of the many people who are running for the Democratic nomination, and there was no reason for her to come out and say that corruption at any level is despicable and we need to fight it and we need to speak up against it even when it's one of our allies. This is jockeying for position within the Democratic Party in anticipation of primaries where people are going to tack further and further to the left. If she actually wins the primary, you can rest assured that she's going to try to bring that back. But that's part of the transformation in American politics, that if somebody else has a point of view and I don't like that person, I need to have the opposite point of view. So unfortunately, I think we're losing a lot of support for Israel within the Democratic Party, also because there's a perception that Trump is so pro-Israel, anything Trump is for, I need to be against. And you're going to see Sanders, I think, who's already declared his candidacy, try to out Warren on her statements. against Israel, because that curries favor within elements of the Democratic Party that some of these candidates are going to believe are going to carry them to victory in the primary. I didn't think her comments were appropriate. I believe that corruption is a bad thing, and I believe that I didn't read Vanderbilt's 57-page report. I read excerpts of it. You know, to be fair to him, calling him a leftist and a hostage of the media is also an apposite, because he's a serious person who was appointed by the Prime Minister. He's been an ally of the Prime Minister. He's no Michael Cohen. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing in for him to say negative things. He's never been accused of lying. He's never admitted lying. This is a serious public official who took a very long time to put together a 57-page report, and it ought to be taken seriously. What happens, we'll find out. It's going to take a long time. The sensitivity is all this is taking place in advance of an election, and because the stakes are so high, people are playing fast and loose with the rules. But coming back to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and just appreciating there's so many weird historical oddities. I was reading about Einstein's first trip to the United States in 1919 was actually with Chaim Weizmann. So it was after the First World War. Einstein was already sort of, iconic, extremely well known for his physics discoveries, and maybe the best known scientist in the world. But there was a lot of discussion, arguments about whether or not he wanted to give speeches and get money, but he wanted the universities to pay him for his speeches. He was hoping that the Harvards and the Princetons of the world would pay him money. And then people thought, well, maybe the Jewish community would want to hear Albert Einstein speak. And by the way, Weizmann and Brandeis did not get along. Remember, I mentioned Brandeis became the head of the Zionist organization in 15, Supreme Court Justice in 16, 1919. He and Weizmann are at odds. Weizmann more sort of the hero of the Eastern European Russian Jews, even though he lived in England already, but he was born in Russia. But Brandeis actually met with Einstein, but not with Weizmann when he was visiting here. And they wanted to give Einstein fundamentally believed that there should be a university in Israel. And that became the Hebrew University, which was launched in 1925, but he really believed in this university idea. And he wanted to raise money for the university. He had a $4 million target. And they went to a community that was led, and he tried to get an audience with Rabbi Judah Magnus. And Rabbi Judah Magnus did not want to meet with Einstein, did not want to raise money. He thought it would be bad for the Jewish movement. And they never met, and they never raised any money, and Einstein was pretty offended. The university was launched in 1925. In the intervening 6 years, Judah Magnus did a 180, and he decided that he is going to actually lead the effort to raise additional money for the university. He was very successful, and he's actually considered to be one of the founders, if not the founder, of the Hebrew University. And Einstein resigned from its board. Years later, the Jewish community, after the war, decided that they needed a Jewish institution in the United States. In 1946, they raised money in the Boston community to start. They bought an old, rundown school and wanted to turn it into a Jewish university, and they wanted to name it after Einstein. For the same reasons that he was offered the presidency of Israel after Chaim Weizmann passed away, and he declined. He just didn't think a school should be named after him. So they named it Brandeis. That's actually a true story. You can look it up. So that was in the 20s and the 40s. Now we have a very powerful relationship between the United States and Israel, and I want to invite you all to think a little bit of philosophically about where's home. I know a lot of people here from Canada. They spend part of the winter in Florida. A lot of us have been to Israel. Some of us have homes in Israel. Some of us were born in Israel, so that feels like home. I know everybody around the room, but this idea of feeling at home somewhere is very powerful, because it also gives you responsibility. It gives you responsibility in the community, right? You establish roots. You care about the schools. You care about the parks. You care about the civil services. Nobody ever takes a rental car to a car wash, right? You just don't do that. You're on vacation, it's a rental car. It's not yours, you don't care about it. But if it's your car, it's your home, you care about it. So now the question is, can you feel at home in two places? And for selfish reasons, I'm going to say that you can. I think you can feel at home if you invest in that home. And I don't think that anybody else living in that place, I mean, I'm not talking about actually invading somebody else's house and throwing them out, but I don't think that Israelis currently living in Israel can tell you what it is to be a Zionist. I don't believe that you have to live in Israel to be a Zionist. I think it's a fundamental component of Zionism. It's like there are a lot of people here who want to be Florida residents. For the non-Canadians in the room, you know that Florida doesn't have a state income tax. So there are a lot of people from New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, other higher income tax jurisdictions that want to become Florida residents for tax reasons. And that's okay. We welcome the Floridians. There are a lot of people, but there's a list of like 14 things. You don't have to meet all of them, but some of them, if you have kids, where do they go to school? What's your driver's license? What are your synagogue or other community affiliations? So the IRS looks at, sorry, not the IRS, the state of Florida doesn't care, but the state of Maryland or the state of New York or the state of New Jersey or Connecticut will look at these parameters to see whether or not they still want to capture you as a resident, or they'll, and there's the amount of time you need to be in or out of a certain place. So you can have your heart set in Israel permanently and still feel very Zionistically passionate. The country has legitimate criteria about who is or isn't eligible to vote in an election. And similarly in the United States, we have our own sort of possessiveness about our own Jewish institutions, and there's a limit to how much we want the Israeli government to interfere with those. And you would think that that shouldn't be a problem, but it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem when you have 77% of the American Jewish community repulsed by President Trump, and you have approximately the same percentage of Israelis who really like President Trump because they don't care about same-sex marriage, and they don't care about gun control, and they don't care about, they may care about it, but they don't care about it here. They don't care what are the restrictions on a woman's right to choose in the United States of America. They don't care about, whether there's a wall or a fence or a barrier between the United States and Mexico. They don't care about trade wars with Canada, China. They care about whether or not it's good for Israel. And that's legitimate, I think. That's what Israelis should care about. So there's enormous support for the president, which people here find repulsive. When President Trump came to pay a condolence call to the Jewish community of Pittsburgh after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue where 11 people were killed, the community essentially boycotted him. Ron Dermer, the ambassador to Washington, was the only person who greeted him there. And I thought that was inappropriate. Regardless of what you think of the president, he is the president of the United States, and he's coming to pay a call. Someone asked me whether or not I thought he's responsible for the, for the acts that took place. Okay, absolutely not on a personal level. The rhetoric is unfortunate. It's unfortunate in Israel also, which is one of the things that bothers me about Otzma. The fact that you're talking about a group that celebrates annually at Baruch Goldstein's grave. I feel his pain for what he witnessed in his life, but going out and killing 29 people in a mosque is indefensible. He's a terrorist and should not be celebrated as anything else. So the tension is only going to get worse. And the reason it's going to get worse is because decisions that are made in Israel impact us here outside of Israel. The whole who is a Jew question, the whole praying at the wall question, the whole nation state question. I think that the American Jewish community, and probably if we had a straw poll here, so I'm not going to put anybody to the test, you'd probably have in this group, I would say would lean slightly to the right of center. Certainly the Israeli community living in the United States leans to the right of center, but the general Jewish population leans very much to the left of center. So when you have this country that you really, really, really desperately want to care about, when you identify strongly as a Zionist, when you send your kids to Jewish schools, you visit Israel with some frequency, and you see a law like the nation-state law that was passed last year, where there was a declaration that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. I certainly don't argue with that. I think that's fair. Jews have unique rights in the state of Israel. Okay, I can live with that too, unique rights. Hebrew is the official language of the state of Israel. Happy with that. Arabic is demoted. It's no longer an official language in the state of Israel. Yeah, it's not really my issue, but okay. I mean, I can understand that. I mean, a lot of people speak Arabic. Should Spanish be, approximately the same number of people who speak Spanish in the U.S. as speak Arabic in Israel? I don't speak either language, but let them communicate in whatever language they want. This suggestion would have been accepted by most Israeli governments for most of its history. And it was proposed, actually, by the Livni government, and she was one of the most vocal opponents of this, because the suggestion was, include a clause that was included in the Declaration of Independence, which was a shotgun document authored in a very, very limited amount of time. And it still, I think, is a much better version than what the nation-state law purposefully excluded, a clause that would say, with equality for all of its citizens. That would have been an easy thing to put in. Israel is the nation-state of the Jews, Hebrew is the official language, Arabic is a secondary language, Jews are entitled to unique rights in the state of Israel, but Israel preserves equality for all of its citizens. And the fact that that was not included, it wasn't an oversight, it went through 3 readings in the Knesset, it created an enormous amount of controversy at the time, because there's so many new controversies every week or every month. People don't remember it, even though it was less than a year ago. Or was it, I think, summer of 2018. There was a political reason for that. Nothing happens by accident. The Israeli government wanted to differentiate between true patriots and non-patriots. And to me, that is it's a poor strategy. It might be a good strategy if you want to get elected. It might be a good strategy if you want to energize your base. But when people like Prime Minister Netanyahu, or people like President Trump, or their left-wing counterparts in the future feel like they have to be polarizing in order to keep their base excited, they're going to offend people domestically, but they're also going to defend people who care outside of that country. And when I'm not speaking personally, but when a lot of people, I mean, I could be speaking personally, but I want to just give you a general assessment. When people see Prime Minister Netanyahu gloss over history in order to cozy up to the leaders of Poland, Hungary, embrace, Viktor Orban from Hungary, Ricardo Duterte from the Philippines, Jair Bolsonaro I wouldn't put him in the same category, but clearly, definitely to the right-wing candidate who just became the head of Brazil. A lot of folks are saying, okay, well, certainly as far as the Europeans are concerned, and the rewriting of Hungarian, Lithuanian, Polish history is not, is not something that sits well with people who believe that these leaders are emblematic of new, strong men who are taking over countries that heretofore at least felt more democratic than they feel today, and fear that that trend towards authoritarianism and populism is going to get even more pronounced in the future. So that's why the things that are going on in Israel really cut to the core of how the American Jewish community views Israel. And I think that there's some good signs. I think Birthright is a wonderful program, where you've got a lot of students between the ages of 18 and 26, and now they've extended up to 32 because they want graduate students to go. And there's another initiative for women called the JWRP, where if you have Jewish kids, if you have kids at home, in day school, the mothers go, the feeling, the idea in the first instance was how are you going to leverage Jewish philanthropy, and you felt that if you got students who were at that inflection point in their lives, it'd be a good chapter during which they should get exposed to what we believe are really positive things about Israel. Same with these women there. There's also a religious component. They're mostly secular, who are involved or exposed to Shabbat and other ritualistic observances. Then they now have a men's group that goes, because a lot of these women came back wanting to observe the Sabbath, and the husbands go, well, what did you turn my wives into? No, don't worry, we've got a flavor for you too. I think these are very positive endeavors, and now the Israeli government has instituted a reverse birthright. And that reverse birthright is taking Israelis, and we take it for granted. We see so many Israelis. I mean, one of these funny jokes is, I was in India, and a lot of Israelis in India. And the Indians are, they're not overwhelmed, but they're very impressed with how many Israelis actually come through there. And I was asking, how many Israelis are there? So I said, probably 8 or 9 million. No, not in India. Altogether. So there are a lot of Israelis that are now coming to the United States that have either not been here before or haven't seen it the way that we would want them to see it from a cross-cultural standpoint, because there is a major disconnect. The United States doesn't get a lot of what's going on in Israel. The new generation doesn't feel for Israel the way the people in this room would feel for Israel, and the reasons are pretty obvious. Who here heard of the Dreyfus Affair? Yeah. Everybody. Okay. What about the Kishinev pogrom? Years? 1894, 1903. How did you feel? How did you feel when that happened? Who felt terrible? Right, you look very young. This took place 125 years ago, and in one case 116 years ago. You weren't alive. These were terrible things that happened, obviously, but it's ancient history. Unfortunately, other things happened. You probably, you certainly either remember the Holocaust or it was very much in your recent memory. The last time Israel faced an existential crisis, I'm looking around, everybody in the room was, I think most people were alive, 1973, the Yom Kippur War. I remember the Yom Kippur War, but I was 8. So that was over 45 years ago. Nobody who's any younger than I am would remember the Yom Kippur War. And they certainly wouldn't remember the Six-Day War, and they certainly wouldn't remember, the Holocaust. They certainly wouldn't remember the creation of the State of Israel. Their memory is a very different world. Their mindset is a stronger Israel, in some cases a bullying Israel, a technological powerhouse. You've got people with funny accents, or some with North American accents, bragging about what we're contributing to the world in medicine and science and technology, and creating strategic partnerships with China and India and the Soviet Union. But great. And yet when they're hanging out with their friends, the narrative they're hearing is about the occupation and about the settlements and about the disenfranchisement of the Palestinians. And there's a social component to this. If you want to be buddies with the people in your class and they're being convinced that this is an imperial colonial power that has taken root in the Middle East, it troubles you, and you have no counterweight to that. You don't have the Yom Kippur War, let alone the Six-Day War, let alone anything else. You have Israeli battles where soldiers were fighting against kids, or suicide bombers were desperately trying to express themselves the same way that the Irgun blew up the King David Hotel in 1946. That's what you have, and it is this concept of freedom fighters against an army. It is this concept against a local bully that is using its disproportionate technological, scientific, and military advantage to the detriment of another people, that does not enjoy the democratic freedoms that Israel brags about all the time. And that's what we're fighting against. And as a consequence, the birthright initiative is awesome, but it's not going to capture everybody. The JWRP initiative is awesome, but it's not going to capture everybody. And there are way, way too many more people who are not going on those trips. And that's why when you start thinking about numbers, every year there's a new census in Israel. Not a formal census, but you know, there's an estimate of how many people live in Israel. It's over 8.9 million people, so we don't have to round up very far to get to 9 million people. It's close to 7 million Jews living in Israel. In the United States, it's harder to count. In Israel, it gets a little tough to count when you still have those Russian immigrants or some of the Ethiopians, but we're talking about, in one case, maybe a couple 100,000 if you're being very aggressive, and in the other case, a few thousand if you're being fair. So in the United States, it could be anywhere between 5 to 6 million people. It could be less than 5. And it's not because people are leaving. And it's not necessarily because the birth rates are lower. It's just they're, you know, in the 1970s, we're here in a conservative synagogue. In the 1970s, conservatives were by far the largest representation of Jews in the United States. Today, anybody want to guess? It's not the conservatives. It was the Reform. The Reform has just been eclipsed. Unaffiliated. They're not the majority, but they're the plurality. The plurality of American Jews today identify, if you could say this, or they just tick off unaffiliated. So their progeny are meaningfully less likely to even be tabulated. They're not going to be part of the next poll. So what this means is, in my opinion, that it is fundamentally critical to curry philo-Semitism within the Jewish community. One of the reasons why some people in Israel are arrogant about, or let me say confident about the relationship with the United States of America, even though there is this erosion of support among the Jewish community, and particularly the younger Jewish community, is because, you know, the Orthodox are growing, and not only are they growing in number, but they're also growing tremendously in terms of their participation in non-Orthodox Jewish organizations. When I first started going to AIPAC, the food wasn't kosher. Food wasn't kosher. So you can imagine how many people were wearing kippahs in the Washington Capitol Hilton. None. Not even the mashgiach. He wasn't there. She wasn't there. But now, not only do you have kosher food, but you have a lot of Orthodox people, including some Haredi people, who come to AIPAC policy conferences. And it's not just because it's grown from 2,000 to 15,000, but two things have happened. One, ultra-Orthodox feel like this is a part of you know, this is a community they want to express themselves within. And there are a lot of legacy AIPAC participants who, alongside their Zionistic pro-Israel journey, they also found religion. Now, that's true. So, and that's the people that Bibi sees. That's the people that the other politician sees. They're the people coming to Israel. They're people running to Israel, not just the Orthodox Jews, but the Orthodox Jews, you know, the still substantial secular or non-Orthodox Jews who support Israel, and the evangelicals. So if you're an Israeli politician, you do the math. Who would have thought 30 years ago that it would be the Christians, the evangelical, Bible-thumping, Jesus-loving Christians, that would have been Israel's best friend in the United States, that would have been the bulwark of support for Israel in the United States? On the one hand, it's wonderful. On the other hand, it's dangerous. You know, when President Trump had his Hanukkah party, probably sometime around Hanukkah, the vice president was, he said 8 days, the vice president was there, and he wanted to give a shout out for the vice president, who's legitimately a strong friend of Israel. I had the privilege of meeting him when he was a member of Congress from Indiana. He then served as the governor. If you look at him in terms of how he's, you know, comporting himself in his role as vice president, I think he's doing a commendable job. But he looks at the American Jews who are there. Right? These are the Malcolm Hodlines and the Howard Kors, and he goes, the vice president, he's terrific. He really, really, really loves your country. You know, now I'll translate what that could have been interpreted to mean. Your country being Israel, right? These are American Jews who were born in the United States for the most part, live in the United States for the most part, earn their money in the United States for the most part, raise their families in the United States for the most part, pay taxes in the United States for the most part. Your country, that's a mindset that, if it takes hold, plays right into the fears of the non-Zionists and the anti-Zionists that we started talking about 45 minutes and 100 years ago. And if that gap becomes a schism, I think we're in trouble. So when there's a concept, a word that I heard, I'm not sure it's a real word, but it's called Jew-centricity. And that means looking at the world through a Jewish prism. So a lot of us do it as Jews, obviously. There's a tendency towards Jew-centricity. We talk a lot about anti-Semitism, but there's also something called philo-Semitism. So Jew-centricity could be negative, right? Jews are greedy and all they care about is money and they're insular. But it could be positive, philo-Semitism. Jews care about each other, they care about education, there's a strong dedication to family and community. Yes, they're ambitious economically, but they're fair in their business dealings. So that's something that could be, like I said, both positive and negative. We need to accentuate the positive, and I think we need to accentuate the positive with our communities. And we can't let we can't let this sibling rivalry become a rivalry. We can't let the sibling relationship become a rivalry. Freud spent a lot of his time on the Oedipus complex. If he was a real Jew, he'd talk about the Cain complex. I mean, the first murder in the Bible was fratricide. And we care a lot about Israel. And Israel, I believe, also really cares about us. I think the Israeli leadership recognizes how important it is to have a partner in the United States. And I don't think the evangelical community, God bless them, pardon the pun, is reliable as a long-term partner. And I think the next generation of Jews in this country are critical. And I think they're critical in Canada, and I think they're critical in England. I think they're important. I think they're important in Canada, England, France, Australia, wherever Jews live. They're important. But in this country, they're critical. And I think that's why, we're having these sessions at the Aventura Turnberry Jewish Center. There's a little school next door that goes up to the first grade. My daughter is far away from first grade, but I think that, for those of us who are sending their kids through the Jewish school system, that's important. I think that's probably the most critical institutional part of Jewish life in the diaspora that needs to be maintained and strengthened. But again, I'm optimistic. You can ask me some questions about the election. We're really going to focus on that next week. I probably would say this every time, but this is definitely one of the more fascinating election landscapes that I can remember. The characters, many of the characters are known, some of the characters are new. The choices seem simpler. The stakes are very, very high, and we've drifted to, like I said earlier, the politics of personality more than the politics of party, certainly relative to any other point in Israel's history. Even when you go back to the days of Ben Gurion and Menachem Begin, these are the names that we remember, but for those of you who are students of Israel's history, you certainly recognize that it was the party infrastructure that enabled those personalities to express themselves. Now people can get up and start a party and participate. So before I take questions, again, I'm happy to answer questions on any of the three classes we had in the past. I'm happy to answer some questions about what's going on in the current Israeli dynamic, including the elements of the indictment. Professor Dershowitz wrote a letter, Alan Bull wrote a letter, other people wrote letters. There are going to be a lot more letters between now and April 9th. There'll be a lot more letters between now and next week. I think sitting here in the United States of America, as Canadians, as Americans, as Israelis, we ought to be thankful that there is such a country like Israel that cares so much about us. We got to be humble that sometimes they don't care about our opinions as much as we would like. When people ask me, well, won't Bibi feel badly if the AIPAC leadership and the AJC leadership gives them a punch in the nose for this act with Otzma. Look, I don't speak to Bibi about this or anything else for that matter, but it's clear to me that the only thing he cares about is 61. And the 61 are in Israel. It's the 61 that's the majority of the bloc that he needs to put together in order to form a government. Nothing else matters to him. And we need to recognize that and respect that. We may not respect the things that he does in order to get there, but he cares a lot more about what his voting bloc is going to choose to do or how they're going to choose to vote on April 9th than any of the voices, however strong, however influential, however powerful here. Do we have the right to express ourselves regarding our views on what he does? Absolutely, I think we do. We can't vote, but we can speak. That's the freedom of speech that we enjoy here. Do we run the risk of alienating the Israeli public? Maybe some of them. Do Jewish institutions like AIPAC and the AJC have a right to express themselves? In my view, that gets a little trickier. I don't think that what Jacob Blaustein and Prime Minister Ben-Gurion agreed in 1950 is sacrosanct. I think it was a very good idea at the time. It was politically expedient for both of them. It certainly served the interests of the American Jewish community and the nascent Israeli government and survived for a very long time. I think the institutions, if they cross certain lines, are going to be, reinterpreted. I don't know what it does for the street cred of AIPAC or the AJC when they do some of their very important work. AJC's mandate is a lot broader. AIPAC's mandate is fairly monochromatic. It's cultivating the U.S.-Israel relationship, and I think that one of the strongest assets that AIPAC enjoys is the perception that it has the ear of the Israeli government when speaking to members of the American Congress and the House and the Senate, and that it has the ear of the American elected politicians when it speaks to their counterparts in Israel. If they feel that this is consistent with that message and that stature, then it's their prerogative to speak. And if they're wrong, then there'll probably be some adjustments. But the relationship is critical. The institutional strength of the Jewish community in the United States is unparalleled in history, unparalleled. And we've talked about the history in the past. It was the golden age of Spain. It doesn't come close, but it was very strong, and it was followed by an Inquisition. Jews felt very emancipated, first in France at the end of the 18th century, and then in England, and then Germany at the end of the 19th century. That didn't last very long. And the quality of our life here, I don't think we should take that for granted either, although I'm not an alarmist. But I think we need to recognize that even though you had a Babylonian community after the destruction of the Second Temple and the Babylonian Talmud that sort of punctuated Jewish theological thought till today, or the Jewish community in Alexandria where you had Jerusalem and Hellenism, all of those were important periods in Jewish history, but nothing like what we enjoy today. And the diaspora is critical, and I think people in Israel need to appreciate that too. I don't want to think about a world without Israel, but when you think about the Jewish history in Israel, it's been consistent ever since King David established the capital in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. And I've said this and I'll say it again, there's always been a Jewish presence in the land, though not always in Jerusalem. But for the most part, it wasn't very good. None of our sovereignty in Israel, or what's now Israel, didn't last very long. I mean, you had a unified kingdom for 70 years, then it separated after Solomon's reign. Shortly thereafter, the Assyrians came from the north in 722 BCE, banished 10 tribes that have never been heard from since, certainly not as Jews. 140 years later, Nebuchadnezzar comes in from Babylonia and exiles the Judean Jews. Cyrus, 50 years later, lets them go back and build the temple, but they're still building a temple, which is a religious site. It's like the Baha'i. They don't control the land of Israel. They have a temple in Haifa. The Jews didn't control what's now Israel then either. They had a temple in what was a Babylonian-controlled province. And that was true ever since. That's why it's called an exile, right? I mean, they mark it 2,000 years and not 2,600 out of the last 3,000 years, because you had an Hasmonean dynasty, the time of the Maccabees, from 165 BCE to 63 CE, when Pompey basically sacked Jerusalem, and that's it. From Judah Maccabee to Pompey, you had sovereignty in Israel, and nothing again until 1948. So the diaspora is very important. Jewish life has thrived and flourished in the diaspora with deep valleys and relatively, fortuitous peaks. But Israel and the diaspora need each other, and that's why I think that it's this bipolar world of contemporary Judaism. We need to hold on dearly to both poles. I'll take questions. Thank you.
Yes. I just was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about the cultural schism that exists, the Kotel and who's a Jew and things like that, and how that affects the relationship, because to me it's just as important as the politics.
Yeah, excellent question. Stephen asks, what about the cultural component, cultural religious component, dealing with the Kotel and who is a Jew? So, who is a Jew, interestingly enough, is in the law of return, Israel's first basic law, the law of return, and it's defined differently in the way the rabbinate defines it. Right? The law of return for non-religious criteria, in other words, eligible to become a citizen in Israel and vote in Israel, is, do you know whose standards we use for that?
Jewish grandparent.
Which one? Yeah, one Jewish grandparent. Where did we come up with that? Hitler, exactly. Extra slice of pizza. Hitler, that's exactly right. The Israeli leadership, when they enacted this basic law, felt that if you were Jewish enough for Hitler to kill, you're Jewish enough to be a citizen of Israel. The rabbinate feels very differently. You need to have a Jewish mother, and they're going to give, I don't know if Jewish mothers get colonoscopies, but they're going to dig very hard if there's doubt to figure out whether or not that's legitimate. And there's certain movements here in the United States and the rest of the Jewish world that resent that. They resent the fact that they believe that their sons married a Jewish woman because she went through a Jewish conversion, and suddenly that's not recognized in the state of Israel, even if they have no interest in ever living in Israel. Right? One thing that I was very touched by, this goes back to the mid-'80s, it was 86, and I was a kid I was a madrich, a counselor for a Canadian high school trip. But before the trip got there, I spent a couple of weeks, my dad's cousin has a cherry orchard. And I'm picking cherries with an Ethiopian guy. He's a way better cherry picker than I could ever be, but I was eating a lot of cherries. And we started talking, and he was very angry. He was very angry with the state of Israel because he was being asked to convert. But I watched him, the other people went to pray when they had to pray, and he certainly knew all the secret handshakes, and he looked like he was living a Jewish life. What do you care? I have an ultra-Orthodox brother. You want to convert? It's like, what's the capital of Canada? Well, I don't know, you're a Jew. He had a brother who didn't make it through the Sudan, so he didn't get on that airlift. So his theory was, if I need to pass a special test, if I need to get a special blessing from a rabbi here to tell me that I'm Jewish, what does that mean for my brother who didn't make the airlift? This was after Operation, I don't know if it was Moses or Solomon. Solomon came first, then Moses in 1990. So that was hurtful to him, and he lives in Israel. So, for sure, I call Vachomer, it's hurtful to us here. As far as praying at the wall, it comes back to what I said about Netanyahu's feelings regarding the Jewish community. I certainly think that if in his heart of hearts, which I don't know and I don't see, he probably would prefer to have a more egalitarian perspective. It's outside the Kotel compound. For any of you, if you've been there, before you get to the main entrance, there's actually a pretty nice place near Robinson's Arch where you can have your non-ultra-Orthodox ceremonies and everything else. And then the ultra-Orthodox said no, and his coalition was a lot more important than the views of mostly non-Israeli Jews. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court backed them. They said that these groups cannot force him to keep a deal that he made and chose to break in order to preserve national politics. So I think you've raised two very important points, of flashpoints of where these things clash. But once again, I think that our role is to just let it settle, because it's not something we're never going to be able to impose our will on an Israeli political system that inevitably is going to care more about its voters than its cousins. You had a question? Yes.
Well, it's more of a comment. May I make a comment?
Sure.
Just with regard to what you said about the Orthodox and the evangelicals, it seems to me that the reason why they have some sort of an alliance, at least here in the diaspora, is because their values, the Orthodox and the evangelicals, right, have more in common, they say, with each other than the leftist groups in each religion. And I don't know if people are aware, but the Jewish world just lost Rabbi Eckstein, and he raised, I know he's controversial in Israel anyway, but because he has raised over $1 billion from Christian evangelicals who have contributed to his organization, and this fellowship that he founded has brought in many Jewish people, especially from Russia. And I find, and John Hagee was another one, and I know that Orthodox rabbis, because I've seen them on television, they've gone up and they have accepted his checks that he has given out. He supports Boys Town. So you have many more.
Go ahead. Just to finish your comment, because not everybody can hear you.
Oh, okay. So it seems to me that there's always been suspicions against the Christian community, but I think the relationship is totally different today among many of these evangelicals, or at least many even Gentiles they are so involved now with Israel, with Talmud even. At one time, the churches used to, poo-poo all of that. And I find that they're studying Talmud. They want to keep, some of them have left their Easter so-called pagan holidays, their Christmas holidays, and they are trying to keep they're trying to follow their Jewish savior who was a Jew.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the reason why you're seeing such a tremendous trend in the evangelical Christian community. Now,
Okay.
it's not everywhere.
Thank you very much for that. So, for those of you who didn't hear the comment, it was essentially saying that we have a lot of support from evangelical Christians. They're liking Jews more than they did in the past, and Rabbi Eckstein, who I had the privilege of meeting many times, and actually consider him a friend, he passed away a couple of weeks ago, and frankly, he after his organization over the course of 30 years did collect over $1 billion, mostly in very small donations from Christians around the United States. And I don't mean this to be cynical, he became a lot less controversial. So that generosity goes a long way. Yes?
Growing up as a young boy, I remember my relatives talking, my uncles and so on, and they said this, is this a true statement? Over 80% of the money they came to buy the arms for the War of Independence in the late 40s came from the American Jewish community. They were active in Fabon and several other Jewish organizations.
I don't know the exact number, but if you're wrong, it might be 90. So yes, the answer is that's a whole separate discussion. I gave this talk probably. It's a true statement. In other words, in 1945, Ben Gurion in New York, they got together, and Teddy Kollek was a big part of this. There's a fellow who lived here in Hampton South for many years. He passed away just 4 or 5 years ago, Eli Shalit. Al Schwimmer, who was the founder of IAI. You had a lot of Americans not only raising the money, most of the money, but you also had a lot of Americans and Canadian and South African and Australian war veterans who participated in the War of Independence. I mean, the Israeli Air Force still spoke English till the 1960s because all of their pilots were Anglo, with one or two exceptions during the first 10 years of independence. Yes, Gary?
You were talking about birthright and the new generation. What are your thoughts about, if not now, to the extent that this is more than a fringe, but the start of something which represents the appeal of many young Jews?
So it's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So I talked about birthright. There's I'd say a counter movement called If Not Now, which touches upon the sentiments that I attributed to many sort of younger Jews that feel that Israel is not just this blessed place that we should visit and applaud, but a place that has earned our criticism for all of its human rights violations and imperialistic colonial tendencies to the detriment of another population. And what makes it worse, and you now know where I'm going with my answer, is that it largely started out as people who benefited from the birthright program and then protested within it. They got up and they, made headlines by saying, thank you for the free trip, but why aren't we going to Ramallah? Why aren't we visiting the refugee camps? Why aren't we, why are we not? And they're riffing off the famous Hillel, comment about if not now, when, that was also appropriated by Herzl in a very Zionistic way in terms of having to build a Jewish state in the late 19th century. Like BDS, I think it's a fringe group, but one that needs to be taken seriously. I had a talk earlier in this lecture series about anti-Semitism and the role of BDS and how thankfully it's been ineffective practically. I think that the biggest fear that I would have regarding If Not Now and JVP, Jewish Voice for Palestine, which are, in my opinion, clearly outside the tent, anti-Israel strains, that they begin to get the apathetic excited. When I mentioned that unaffiliated was the largest single grouping within, not the majority, but the largest single plurality within people taking these polls right now, that's because most of them are apathetic. So there are lots and lots of eligible students who choose not to go on birthright trips because it's not their thing. And if the Not Now movement becomes popular, then the question is who's going to fund it. Maybe the Qataris will fund it, but then the Israeli government will decide whether or not they want to issue, you don't need a visa if you're American to go to Israel, but they're certainly not going to participate in the same way they participated in birthright. So the way they were able to get this kind of media attention is because they were embedded in one of these very proud national projects. You've got the birthright buses, the Taglit, the brand, the fanfare. So they were very visible. If Colin Kaepernick could not throw a football, nobody would care whether or not he kneels at the national anthem. So he was able to embed himself within the NFL, become a star quarterback, play in the Super Bowl, and people paid attention because he got that kind of exposure. I think that if you have what's still very much of a fringe element, I don't know that Birthright is going to be more vigilant in terms of screening how 18-year-olds feel about Israel before they put them on a bus, but I think that there's a lot of self-selection involved. And my hope is that among the folks on college campuses, which is where this group took root, you have enough students like your children and other people's children and grandchildren who are well educated about Israel, who've learned about Israel, then these elements will be talked down or talked out of their positions. I think the Israeli government is becoming increasingly aware of the work that needs to be done on campus, but I still feel that our biggest challenge is this concept of, and this tendency of feeling that if somebody else that I hate is for something, I need to be against it. And as long as there's so much visceral antipathy towards this president, this administration, and the perception that his support for Israel is so strong, so steadfast, and so reliable that you're going to have people who never thought about the Israel issue come out against the Israel issue because that's a definitive statement against one of the president's signature policies. Yes.
Thanks for your wonderful talk. I enjoyed it immensely. A brief comment and a short question. First of all, I would like to reiterate what the lady said before, how much we should appreciate the support of the evangelical Christians. John Hagee made it a point that he organized trips to Israel during the Intifada for the evangelical Christians at a time when most Jews were afraid to go to Israel. Now my question is the following. You've always emphasized how important in AIPAC bipartisan support was from both parties. Aren't you worried about the erosion of support in the Democratic Party and the left wing of it? There are at least 3 congresswomen who are strongly anti-Israel, and that party is very much different in terms of support for Israel than it used to be.
Well, thank you for your comment and your question. Yeah, I think that in each of the previous classes I've talked about the threat of the Democratic Party choosing to make this a partisan issue. And I feel that it's a problem for both parties. I feel that the Republican Party has enjoyed active Jewish support on a level that it never enjoyed in the past. I think the most famous demonstration sort of in our generation of this was when James Baker said, F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway, and he was right. Statistically speaking, he was right. They also didn't contribute very much money to Republican politicians, and that's changed. The Jewish community is much more active in terms of supporting Republican political candidates than they were in the past. The voting numbers haven't changed a lot. They've changed a little bit. There tends to be stronger voter participation against people who care deeply, and you have the Orthodox and other members of the community who are very supportive of what this administration and the previous Republican administration represented vis-a-vis the friendship with Israel, and took issue with what the Obama administration's relationship was with Israel during its 8 years in government. And I agree with you. I think that in my response to Gary and what you've heard me say over the past few weeks, the biggest threat to the bipartisan support for Israel in the United States is the counterweight to this famous Quranic statement, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the friend of my enemy is my enemy. That's not in the Quran, but it seems to be the zeitgeist of the current political climate. So let's stay optimistic and hope that that inclination is tempered by vigilant cultivation of our friends in the Democratic Party, because they exist, they're real, and they need to be supported as well. So Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week.